all familiar with, whose documents we now possess and consider to be holy writ, etc. This Eusebius says these groups are poverty-stricken because they have such a poverty-stricken view of Christ. Many of us in the modern world would say they have a very elegant view of Christ. In fact, it's very reasonable and rational and a normative view, and the kind of view I think many modern people could personally relate to. And we'll find that where James is concerned, James will be this kind of person, advanced above other people by his preeminent righteousness, for which reason he was called the righteous one. And in all texts that have come down to us, James is called the righteous one. That is, he's advanced among others by his preeminent virtue or righteousness, so much so that in the Eusebius text, which is one of our principal sources for James, Eusebius gives us all the material we want without realizing it, because he culls material from previous theologians who have since disappeared. Almost everybody who Eusebius culled material from disappeared after he culled the material. And we only have the material that he culled often and not the actual writing itself. So we have to be grateful that Eusebius culled the material. He was the first big cribber. And at least he gave us his source and he was fairly faithful to it, but we're sort of worried that everybody he seems to have touched disappeared after that. So in fact, it might have been the first case of church censorship that might have occurred, and I'm sure that it was, in fact. But in any event, even when Eusebius gives us the passage, I'll throw another big name at you. Okay, I'll just say that Eusebius is 300, maybe 40s or so. And Hegesippus is the 100 to 180s. So when you're with Hegesippus, you're really getting back there, aren't you? You're really getting closest to the time. And also, Hegesippus is from Palestine, a native Palestinian source. But he hasn't survived anywhere but in Eusebius. If any of you find him anywhere, let me know, because you'll be a millionaire if you do. It's the most valued early church testimony that none of us have anymore. But Eusebius culled him, and all the testimonies about James come from him. So you see, in the 100 to 180s, James was the preeminent Christian of his time and place. And when Eusebius doesn't give us his opinion, because he doesn't have an opinion, which is, when he does, I said in my book, the man is demented. But aside from being demented, he's an extremely, at least fair, well, not fair, he's unfair, but he's faithful reproduction of what he culls. So he gives you the material. I say he's demented because he's a terrible anti-Semite, and he actually throws in all of these Christ-killer epithets throughout his work and feels that the death of hundreds, almost millions of people is justified, and that when mothers eat their babies, this is a wonderful thing. So out of him flows the milk of loving kindness, loving your enemy, and all of these good things. Anyway, this is the institutor of the Western-oriented church as we know it, to some extent, at least through the councils and the conversion of Constantine. So James rescues us from that kind of thing. I said in the blurb on the back cover of this Penguin paperback that's just come out, Eisenman shows how, as James was written out, anti-Semitism was written in. That is, in the documents that we have. And, by rescuing James from the oblivion into which he was cast, the final conclusion of James, the brother of Jesus, is in the words of the Jerusalem Post apocalyptic: who and whatever James was, so was Jesus. So we'll get to all those theses tonight as we move along. But the point is that this is how we in the West can rescue ourselves from this terrible scourge of anti-Semitism. Because in my view, the fountain of anti-Semitism are the Gospels themselves. And this is what has conditioned the Western mind to think and knee-jerk in the reaction that we have it. And that was written in through Pauline Christianity, and the kind of Christianity that Eusebius amply demonstrates in his work. And I think once and I'll show you how the character of Peter has been totally rewritten from an anti-Semitic perspective. And so he spouts classical anti-Semitism. So we think classical anti-Semitism is God-given, when in fact Peter was a Semite. So we'll see that how those people, and I consider that's easily identifiable, the authors then become easily identifiable as overseas Roman Greco authors, nothing to do with Palestine whatsoever. Because the mark of a Palestinian document will be that it can be anti-sectarian. That is, it can be anti-Pharisee, it can be anti-Sadducee, it can be anti-Essene, it can be anti-Herodian, but it can't be anti-itself. That is, only the Greeks would be anti the Jews and vice versa, but a Palestinian document would never be anti-Semitic. It would be anti-sectarian, and we'll see that there is very strong anti-sectarian strife in the Dead Sea Scrolls, very strong, aggressive, but the scrolls are never anti-Semitic, they're philo-Semitic. They can't possibly be anything else. It's a contradiction in terms. So the first step in evaluating the historicity of any tradition is look what it's trying to prove. Before you mouth it or you spout it without thinking, look what it's agenda is. Look what it's trying to ascribe to Jesus, and in this case, Peter. But we're very fortunate. We have documents that are about Peter from other sources that have not come down through a Romanized Curia. We have documents called, of course, the Romanized Curia has told us the documents are called the Pseudo-Clementines. I'll get back to where I was in a minute. I like to spin off because you come to a new thing and your audience may not know what you're talking about, so you have to go off in little swirls to try to explain to them what you're talking about. Then often you don't get back to where you were. You get out on a limb and then you saw yourself off. So what I like to do, often I surprise most of my students anyway. I don't know if I'll surprise you because as I said, I never did such a big group. But I often get out on a limb and it looks like I'm going to saw myself off, and then sometimes I just jump back at the last moment. So a few times I may fall off and then you'll get me back, but normally I do get back to where I'm going. How come we got out on that limb? Pseudo. You see how these are pejoricized? You're already taught. Now, how many of you have heard of the Pseudo-Clementines? The pseudo, here, I just wrote on the board. Here, Pseudo-Clementines. There it is. I know